Our next lesson, your main objective for today is to recognize square roots and be able to classify real numbers. So the inverse of squaring a number, so if this is 7 squared, is taking the square root of the solution. So square root looks like this down here. So if I have 7 squared, that's equal to 49. So 7 is the square root of 49. Basically saying if I do 49, and this right here is my square root, that's going to be equal to 7. What is a simplified version of each expression? So again, it's asking for the square root of 64. In your head, you should be thinking, what two numbers that multiply together equal 64? And you have to think of two numbers that are the same. So in this case, I could think, oh, 8 times 8 fell on the floor. I picked it up and it was 64. So the square root of 64 would be 8. Second one, if you're thinking, what two numbers multiply to get 25? And that would be 5. 5 times 5 is 25. When I have a division like this, there's two ways you can do this. One way is to simplify the square root of 1 over the square root of 36. And this is the way I would suggest to do it. So now, the square root of 1, what two numbers multiply to get 1? That's just 1, and that's that special number. And what two numbers multiply to get 36 would be 6. So this here is saying 1/6 times 1/6 is equal to 136, which is true. So biology, you should push pause and read this whole thing. I'm not going to read this whole thing. What I am going to do, when you're looking at word problems like this, I typically read the last sentence first. What is the approximate side length of the square to the nearest micron? This question right here. That's what I'm looking at. So it looks like there's a lot of words here. If I just wanted to pick out the math, if I look, here's where my number is, 386 square microns. That's telling me that's the area. So if I were to just draw one square, this is saying this whole thing is worth 386 microns squared. It's asking you what is just one side length. So if you remember from your 6th grade math, I believe, to find the area of a square, you would do a number squared to find the area. So in this case, let's say this side length is x, this side length is x, and that's equal to 386. So it's asking me what is the side length, so basically what is x? So to get rid of a square, you have to take the square root. Just like multiplying and dividing, they cancel each other out, adding, subtracting. Squaring and square root cancel each other out. It's the opposite or inverse. So if I take the square root on one side, I have to take the square root on the other side. I would do this in your calculator. So if I type that in my calculator, the square root, and then type 386, I would get 19.64. Now, in my question, it says, what is the approximate side length? So it's asking to the nearest micron. So my answer is, if I were to round this, the 6 behind this decimal, that's what I use to help me round to my nearest whole number. So since 6 is greater than 5, then this would round to 20. So the approximate side length would be 20 microns. Right here is a page of formal definitions for rational, natural, whole, integers, and irrational numbers. You do not have to write this all down. I would, however, write down this diagram. It's a little easier for you to understand. So when I'm looking at these numbers, rational numbers, when I'm looking from left to right, rational numbers are basically any decimal or fraction that turns into a decimal and it repeats or stops. So 0.3 would be a rational number. Integers, when I talk about integers, I typically will tell you they're all the tick marks that are on a number line. So it's all the numbers that are on a number line. Whole numbers are positive numbers and 0. And natural numbers are just positive numbers. So that's the difference between all of those. Now, irrational numbers, these numbers are decimals that will never repeat. So if you look here, it does not have the exact same thing over and over again because that decimal will never repeat, so that would be irrational. So for these questions, it says, which subset of the real numbers does each number belong to? Before you can answer that, you should always simplify the problem. So if I look at this first problem, the square root of 9 is 3. So that's a number, that's a natural number because it's positive, but it's also a whole number because it's positive. That's also an integer. Rational numbers has decimal, so it's not going to be rational. So I would say that this 3 is part of an integer, whole number, and natural. Looking at the second problem, 3/10. I like to change my fractions into decimals. It's easier for me to see. So that's 0.3. Now looking at the options that I have here, the only option that would work would be a rational. Whenever you have a decimal, it's either going to be a rational or irrational number. In this case, it's rational because the decimal point stops, which would be the same thing for C, because it is a decimal point and it stops. Now, if you were to put square root of 12 in your calculator, you would get something like 3.464101615. Basically, the numbers do not repeat. So since it is a decimal, it's either rational or irrational. Since they do not repeat, it will be an irrational number. So now we're getting into inequalities. So if you want to pause, if you don't remember, these are my inequality signs and what they represent. So the first one is a less than, and then greater than. Whenever you have a line underneath, that means it's or equal to. So I want to compare I want to write the inequality statement between these two numbers. So I'm going to have square root of 17. I'm going to leave a space for right now because I don't know what I should put in there. And 4 1/3. Now, I've said this before, and it's always going to be easier if you change any numbers to decimals because it's easier to compare. So square root of 17 is 4.123 and so on and so forth. 4 1/3 is 4.3 repeating. So when I'm looking at this, I want to put the correct inequality symbol in between the two numbers. So looking at here, after the point, I have 1 on the left. After the point on the 4.3, I have 3. So that means 4.3 is larger, and they're not the exact same. So then I want to keep my inequality statement as is. So this would be my final answer. What is the order from the following numbers from least to greatest? Right now, I would like you to pause the video and try to solve this by yourself. The first thing you should do is change all numbers to decimals. So as you can see, I changed or simplified the numbers, as you can see there. And now it says from least to greatest. So I know that negative numbers are the smaller of the two. So here's a negative number and here is. The larger the negative number, the smaller it is. So my smallest number here is negative 1.5. And the second negative number I have is negative 2/3. You could have also written negative 0.6 repeating. So I've used both of these two. Then I have 0.4 would be my next number, if you're looking at a number line. And I have the square root of 2, which is 1.4, and the square root of 4, which is 2. So square root of 2 would be next, and then the square root of 4. And these are my numbers, least to greatest. Again, you could have also written these numbers in the simplified decimal form, and that would be acceptable. So right now you should finish the video, Fill out the answers and submit them for your points. Have a great night.